On February 9th of 2004, 21-year-old UMass student Maura Murray drove from her dorm in Amherst, Massachusetts to the White Mountains of New Hampshire.
At approximately 7:27 p.m., Maura spun out her 1996 Saturn on a hairpin turn on Route 112 in North Haverhill. There has never been a credible sighting of Maura since.
Maura is 5 foot 7 inches tall. She weighs 120 pounds, and she has brown hair and hazel eyes.
If you have any information regarding Maura's disappearance, please submit it to us,
The Murray family at MauraMurrayFamilyDirect@gmail.com.
or the New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit.
This is Missing Maura Murray. Welcome back to Missing Maura Murray. I'm Tim, being joined today by Lance virtually. Lance, how are you today?
I am doing so well today. How are you, Tim?
I'm doing well. I really can't complain, Lance.
Can't complain.
Yeah, and I'm especially happy because we have a buddy on, our friend Josh Hallmark of True Crime Bullshit.
Too much time always goes by before we have Josh back in our world again, and he comes every single time with something that is sort of batshit crazy. He did True Crime Bullshit Season 1 and Season 2 about the serial killer Israel Keys. I know a lot of people listen to that show, but Season 3 of True Crime Bullshit might be crazier. I mean, it's just as crazy, right?
It's wild. I was just looking at the video that we recorded with Josh, and you can find that on YouTube. Yeah, my jaw was dropped at a couple points. I was like, geez, Tim, you don't have to be so dramatic. But some of the things that Josh was saying were absolutely crazy about this case of Kelly Cochran.
Yeah, Kelly Cochran is a rare instance where you have a female serial killer who was active for so many years and probably is more prolific than what she's been convicted for. I think she was convicted for just 2 murders, but I think what is the theory, she and her husband were linked to maybe 9.
Yeah, it's quite confusing, and Josh is really doing a great job trying to unpack it on his show, because Kelly will tell the truth 1 minute and then just lie for no reason the next. So it's been very tough to figure out what's truth with Kelly Cochran.
And then there's all of these bizarre, like, wild side stories about cannibalism, both voluntary cannibalism and involuntary cannibalism. That's not even a joke. That actually happened in this case. The way her husband died, you think that it's horrific, but then Josh tells you a little bit more, a little bit more detail about what Kelly did or claims she did to her husband when he died. And now she's in prison, and Josh is waiting on the go-ahead, I guess for lack of a better word, to actually speak with her.
Yeah, I can't wait to see if that happens, or I should say when that happens on his show, because I believe that it will eventually. So you really need to listen to True Crime BS, True Crime Bullshit, from Josh Hallmark. Subscribe. There are links in the show notes. And we hope you enjoy this interview with Josh. He's a great buddy, and he's a lot of fun to chat with. Welcome back to the podcast, Josh Hallmark of True Crime Bullshit. Josh, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you guys?
Excellent. Thanks for asking. Yeah.
We got the whole isolation routine down now. Seems like you have your system in place as well. You're a bit in a blacked out, looks like a coffin.
A little bit. I really wanted to, be meta about this whole true crime thing, so I thought I would just record from inside a coffin in the basement of our farmhouse.
That's gonna have a lot of good qualities when you're trying to control sound. Because are you officially buried 6 feet underground as well?
I mean, only a foot, just because I'm not a super muscular, energetic person. So like I tried to do the 6 feet thing, but I got tired and just was like, this will have to do. So
gotta dig through, in and out. Yeah.
Probably a hassle every time.
Sounds great.
Yeah. The sound is exquisite.
Yeah. I think you really hit on something here. I think this is going to be the new trend.
Yeah, like they say, no one can hear you screaming if you're below ground. So.
Exactly. Just hook yourself up with that little bell. You know, that system. Yeah. So.
Well, Josh Hallmark, you
Tim,
join
we're
us
talking
again.
about this coffin thing.
Sorry, I interrupted. I was changing the subject.
To something more relevant or something?
Well, I'm just so impressed with Josh's work. He does a podcast called True Crime Bullshit. And the first 2 seasons were on the serial killer Israel Keys. And Josh's approach is very unique. And Josh has spun off into a 3rd season here on a different serial killer.
Yeah, so this season I'm focusing on Kelly Cochran. And a lot of people were disappointed that we were moving on from Keys. And I will say 2 things. One is like, we're still working on Keys and there will be another Keys season coming. But more importantly, Kelly Cochran is an insane story that I think anyone who could appreciate the Keys story will appreciate this, because we've got just a insane sociopath. We've got lies. We've got cannibalism. We've got some very bizarre crime cover-ups. It's a roller coaster in a way that the Keys story didn't quite deliver on.
Right. Yeah, it's a different telling. With Israel Keys, he had been arrested and had committed suicide before you embarked on your journey, which was sort of trying to connect missing people in the country to Keys' spontaneous killing trips that we know he took, and we know he's responsible for, or we think he's responsible for more that he's officially spoken about, at least. And so that was kind of your goal there, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think Kelly was a really great transition, because there are a lot of very similar storytelling elements. You know, we know she killed more people than she was arrested for. Even that number is a little dubious. And we kind of know her MO, which, much like Keys, there was a mythology and then the reality. And I think with Kelly, there's this built-up mythology, and you kind of break it down and find out a lot of it is bullshit. And then you can get to the reality, which is like she has at least 4 or 5 other victims, possibly more than that. We know that they were all people that she had sexual affairs with. And so then it's a matter of matching up missing persons who disappeared in places she was under interesting circumstances. So I think, much like Keys, it is like building up all the facts and then going out and trying to match them to missing persons cases.
Very cool.
Can you give us a quick background on Kelly and when she was active as a serial killer and what got her started?
Yeah, so we don't know when her serial killings began, but she was arrested in 2016. Her last known murder was October of 2014, so this is very recent. She, according to Kelly, who is a compulsive liar, when she married her husband, who was also her childhood sweetheart, they grew up next door to each other, he forced her into a murder pact, like on the night of their wedding, which was essentially, if she ever cheated, he would kill whoever she cheated with, and if he ever cheated, she would have to kill who he cheated with. Of course, Kelly told us about this pact after her husband mysteriously died while they were being investigated for another murder. So we don't really have any corroboration that it actually happened, but we do have corroboration that the two of them were killing people that they were having romantic affairs with. And she studied, much like Keys, she knew she was different, so she started studying psychopaths, sociopaths. She actually went to school for psychology. She also took a bunch of forensics courses. Interestingly, yeah, so she really was a pro at, I guess, being a serial killer. She also studied serial killers, and we talk about it in one of the most recent episodes. If you look at her resume, it's basically like best jobs for serial killers list. You know, she was a long-haul truck driver. She was a pig farmer. She worked in mines, so she had access to all these abandoned mines all over the country. She built pools, so she was excavating, 6 to 10 feet deep holes in people's backyards and then filling them with concrete. So she, more than anyone, almost in an H.H. Holmes way, had the ability to make bodies disappear without ever being questioned.
Right.
So you mentioned that her and her husband came up with this murder pact the night of their wedding. If the other one were to cheat on them, then they would kill the respective lover. And then you said that did you say that they were having affairs and killing the people that they were sleeping with? So
yes.
And what happened? So it was like a serial killing couple. What happened to the husband?
So funny story. They got away with this for a significant amount of time. And again, we don't know when this began, but we can say at the earliest when they got married in 2002. But they got busted and started being looked into in 2014 when one of her coworkers, who she was having an affair with, disappeared. And everyone at work kind of pointed the finger at them, saying, oh, they were having an affair. And also she had complained that her husband had threatened to kill her. So they started looking into him, and the pressure really came onto them. They fled the state. Eventually, the cops caught up to them, brought him in for an interview, and they interviewed her husband first, who was this really meek kind of just mess. He had been in and out of mental health facilities. He was on just a laundry list of psychopharmaceuticals. And they interview him first, then they interview Kelly, and as Kelly's leaving, when she lawyers up, the investigator says very flippantly and untruthfully, oh, by the way, your husband had a lot to say. And then just several months later, her husband mysteriously dies of a drug overdose, which we later come to find out, spoiler alert, so when they found his body, he had heroin in him and he had choked on his own vomit, which was, all the telltale signs of an overdose. Later, we found out that Kelly had actually forced herself to throw up into his mouth, so it looked like he choked on his own vomit.
Yes.
And then smothered him to death.
What?
Yeah.
You're saying that wasn't his vomit that he choked on?
No, it was hers. She smothered him with a pillow and then threw up into his mouth to make it look like he choked on his own vomit.
I've never heard that. That's something else.
Yeah, she's a piece of work.
What's even more amazing is you started the story by saying, funny story.
Yeah, that paid off.
That was a punchline.
Yeah.
Okay, so
crap.
did they ever have a history of doing heroin? Did she just have heroin lying around? That was actually in his system?
It was actually in his system, not enough to kill him, though. She had been a habitual drug user. He had not, other than, prescribed drugs. And he smoked a lot of pot, which, to me is not a drug, but that's a different conversation. And so she claimed...
Drug. It's the gateway.
It is, yes. Gateway to
fun
getting murdered by your wife. So she said that he was under a lot of stress. He wanted to try heroin to please her. And, sure enough, the first time that happens, he dies.
Wow. So how did they find that out? Did they suspect that he didn't die of the vomit that it looked like? Or did the medical examiner discover that and then decide to test?
Yeah, they didn't test the vomit, but they had already been investigating them. And when this happened, local law enforcement in Indiana, where this took place, kind of took it at face value, but Michigan came in, the state they had fled from, and were like, we want to be present for the medical examination. And when they did the ME, they found that he had been smothered. That was his cause of death. And when they revealed this to her, she finally was like, oh, yeah. And they were like, well, what about the vomit? And she said, oh, I threw up in his mouth. And she said it very nonchalantly, like it would be a normal thing to do when murdering somebody.
They didn't ever test it, though, to find out if that was true?
No, because at that point, he had been cremated.
But she was I see. But she seems, and it's very clear in your work that she can hardly tell the truth at all.
No, and it's interesting because I do think a lot of it is compulsive, but I think a lot of it is also premeditated.
Okay.
You kind of come to find out through the story that she had been planning for getting caught for a very long time, and her alibi was always going to be was that her husband abused her and her husband did it. And she had done little things all along the way to make it look like her husband killed the victim that she got arrested for, and that she was forced into doing it by her abusive husband. And she had dropped little hints. She had gone to HR at her work just a month before they killed her lover and said that her husband tried to kill her and threatened her. And then the day that they killed her lover, she told her husband that her phone was broken and needed to use his, and so was texting her lover with her husband's phone all day. So it looked like she had nothing to do with it. He was texting him. She just was very calculated. So she's a liar because she's a liar, but she's also a liar premeditatedly. And also in court, she lies a lot, and it's so, I believe, that you can't believe anything she says, so how can you convict her for anything she said in the past? Because she, at times, says, I'm a serial killer, I killed 21 people. At times, she says she's never killed anyone in her life, and there's not a timeline to this. It's just kind of, if you catch her on the right day, she's killed 20 people, and if you catch her on the wrong day, she's never killed anyone, and she's an abuse victim. It goes back and forth.
Jeez.
Are you impressed by her when you're researching her and hearing what she's saying and starting to understand that she has been planning all of these steps, even including her capture? When you see it all playing out like that and her behavior, do you take a step back and just say, like, if she was in a legit business, she probably would be a CEO, you know? Are you impressed by her?
You know, it's funny. I interview a criminal psychologist who's an expert in female psychopaths, and we talked a bit about Kelly as an underachiever and how much she could have gotten done with her life had she gone, a more conventional route by not killing people. And I've actually been challenging myself because my relationship with her versus with Keyes is wildly different. And I don't know if it's because I spent 3 years working on the Keyes case, or I guess 4. And I've spent about 4 months working on the Kelly Cochran case, so I think there's more familiarity. But I tend to, with Keyes, where I had a little more compassion because of his upbringing and was terrified of him and thought of him as someone who was a mixture of nature versus nurture that turned him into this monster who was like calculated and really smart. I tend to view Kelly as just like an unhinged psychopath who chose to be awful. And I think that for me, that's actually like an inherent bias that I'm trying to work through. And a lot of this season is going to be looking through the lens of sexism and true crime and how there's huge disparities in the ways we treat male victims and male killers versus female victims and female killers.
Ah, yes.
Yes. Real quick, you just said she chose to be awful.
I don't believe she did, but that's always kind of my visceral reaction with her because she's just so and I think it comes down to charisma. Keyes had a lot of charisma, so when you're listening to him in these interviews, you're like, oh, this guy's a monster. But sometimes you're like, I get him in a certain sense, as to where Kelly has no charisma whatsoever. She just seems to enjoy being a monster, and so it's hard to really view her with more of an open mind, which again is that responsibility and onus is on me. And so I'm trying to get over these reactions I have to her, which are wildly different from my reactions to Keyes.
Yeah, you spent a lot of time with Keyes, but it does seem like, she's got this Machiavellianism about her that where she wants to manipulate and deceive.
Yeah, Keyes always talked about wanting to be liked and wanting to feel like he was normal, and even he couldn't murder someone if he had talked to them, because as soon as he talked to someone, he would just want to be friends with them. And, you can take that with a grain of salt, but even just his wanting to tell that story, I think, says a lot about him, as to where Kelly goes in and, speaks of herself as this murderous mastermind who doesn't give a shit about anybody and enjoyed killing people. And then a day later talks about how she's a victim of domestic abuse and her husband was this murderous mastermind and, he killed the love of her life. And she's such a liar and it's such extremes that it's hard to really identify and care about anything she says. And you just see her as someone who seems to be gloating that she murdered at least 2 innocent men.
When you were looking into other serial killers to do for season 3, I'm sure you had a list that you had laid out as possibilities. Was her being a female something that put you over the top with this particular case, or did it not factor in at all? Was it just simply how she behaved, her personality, and all of those things that you described?
It kind of did. I think what it came down to for me was with Keyes, I spent so much time on the Charlie Project and on NamUs and all these missing persons websites, and it really formulated the way I saw missing persons cases, which is most of the names on those lists are of middle-aged white men, which is not what is portrayed in the media. And I really, even with the Keyes case, was kind of internally struggling with what does that mean? What does that mean about our culture and our media and the way we treat men and women? And then I stumbled upon this woman who was killing mostly straight white men in their 30s and 40s. And I thought, wow, that's a great story to tell, especially when you think about female psychopaths and there isn't a lot of information about them. I think most people can name one female serial killer. So I just thought that's really interesting. And there are enough parallels between Keyes that I think it would make for a great transition. I enjoy the spectacle of Kelly a little bit. It's such a contrast from Keyes, which was very serious, and this is very serious, but also there's so many just cuckoo bananas pieces of it that it brings, levity is a bad word, but it makes it a little more interesting in ways that I had not done with Keyes.
Are you exploring the ethos and pathos again?
I am. Knee deep in the ethos and pathos.
Or did you already answer that? Because I still don't know what those words mean.
I did, but it's okay.
Okay, good.
Well, you said something that was interesting about Keyes, and I don't know if a lot of people talk about it because I think Keyes is described as a psychopath. I think a lot of people will say that he is the poster child or the poster boy for being a psychopath serial killer. But then there's this element to him that you talk about where he wants to really make sure people know that, hey, I don't like killing. I want to be their friends, and I'd rather be someone's friend. I want to be their friend, and it hurts me to think that I'm going to have to kill this person. But that's not empathy, right? Because isn't that one of the major bullet points of being a psychopath is that you lack empathy? So is it just an act?
Yeah.
Or do you think that he actually did want to be friends with people?
It's hard because Keyes is a very complex figure. He has a daughter, and his whole thing after his arrest was protecting his daughter, and also to a certain extent his girlfriend, which to me does not scream of empathy, or does not scream of a lack of empathy. And it's not something I've seen with other serial killers, where once they're arrested, they seem to care at all about the people who were in their lives. It could be argued that that's more of a reputation thing, and he doesn't want people to see him as a bad person. But even that, to an extent, is wildly different from Kelly, who doesn't seem to care how people see her. And it's certainly you look at Ted Bundy, who kind of, at a certain point, enjoyed being a monster. And with Keyes, that never existed. And he did seem to have a lot of conflicting feelings, even kind of ambiguously or not as overtly when he's talking, and he'll off the cuff mention oh man, this is really going to mess up my family. So to me that and I'm not a psychologist, but that was something that always resonated with the Keyes case. He is a psychopath through and through almost definitively, but there are elements of caring about other people.
Have you ever had a lot of people reach out to you with some insight into Kelly's behavior? Any professionals who listen to the show that maybe are, possible contributors later on?
Yeah. So I think what's interesting about Kelly is kind of when I started with Keyes, not many people knew about her, but people have been responding pretty strongly. In fact, I got an email the other day of someone being I think your approach to this might be a little sexist. And I was like, no, I agree. And trust me, it's coming. We're working on it. And I've had some people like Michelle Kazuba, who is heavily involved in private investigations for the missing, and she's been a huge contributor. So I think there are a lot of people who have some expertise that I lack that have been participating at varying levels, and I'm excited to kind of collaborate further with them as we get further into this.
Yeah, that's cool. What's the story about cannibalism?
Oh, man. So, this whole case is really predicated on the victim that got her caught, which is different with Keyes because, Samantha Koenig got him caught, but that was kind of like the wrapping on the box that was Keyes, as to where Kelly, everything kind of comes back to this as her only known victim that was not her husband. He went missing. 2 days later, they hosted a barbecue at their house and invited their neighbors. And their neighbors said that for some people who were struggling with money, it was a significant amount of meat, and it tasted like meat they'd never tasted before. It had a weird texture and look, and when they asked Jason, he said, "Oh yeah, I've worked as an exotic meat butcher my whole life." And
it had fingernails.
Yeah, basically. And when you look into Jason's history, he's never been a butcher ever. And then going through, which
not on the traditional sense.
Yeah. And then going through, which will come out in a future episode, they make jokes with their friends on Facebook about like, oh, well, we're cannibals. And and they even talked about how when they had the pig farm, they weren't cannibals per se, but they were eating the pork that had eaten their victims. So they allude to it way before this barbecue ever takes place, and everyone who attended the barbecue said that meat smelled strange, it tasted strange, and no one has ever found this victim.
Jesus.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how two people like that find each other. Are they like, can they spot each other in a crowd? You know what I mean? Like, or is it just,
how did these two meet?
Yeah.
They grew up together, and we think, Jason Cochran, was this very emotionally fragile man who was dependent on Kelly in every aspect, financially, emotionally, psychologically, and she's a psychopath, and she's also incredibly manipulative, and I think that kind of like the Karla Homolka and I forget her husband's name, that case, it's someone who sees someone who will do anything for them and exploits that. And the criminal psychologist Joni Johnston, who I spoke with, said that in a lot of cases, people like Jason will derive pleasure not from the act, but from the pleasure that the act brings to their spouse. And so for him, it's about he's so dependent upon Kelly, and he's able to do this thing for her, which in turn makes her value him more.
And you think that it was her idea to come up with the murder pact? Like, all of this was her idea, and she was flexing her influence on him?
I don't think the murder pact ever happened. I think that's something she used as an excuse after he was dead and couldn't corroborate that it did or did not happen.
Gotcha.
But he really said that thing about being a butcher, and like that would seem to be like enjoying the process of almost getting one over on someone. I would call that very psychotic behavior.
Yeah, and we get a manuscript again with the Keyes case. We had a manuscript, and here we have Jason had been working on a manuscript which was called Where Monsters Hide.
Yeah,
and it's basically about him killing people. And there are some parallels to missing persons cases, which we'll get into in the series later on.
Excellent.
And it does kind of deep dive his psychology, which this is a deeply disturbed man who, again, I think was being manipulated by a woman who had murderous ideologies.
And so she is currently incarcerated.
She is.
Where?
In Indiana. I believe Indiana or Michigan. I have to go set up a P.O. box, and I've been avoiding doing that because of, coronavirus. But once that is done, I will be sending her a letter because she really enjoys attention. So I imagine she will be more than happy to participate in the podcast.
Are you afraid that she might work her her spell. She might cast a spell over you. Because Tim and I were talking offline, and we think that mostly Tim feels this way. We feel like one of your cases that you do a deep dive in, there'll be like a Patty Hearst situation happening. And this might be it. Tim was all about it, and I'm like, I don't know. Josh is like a really grounded, well-rounded person. I think he can, mentally take this. And Tim was like, I don't know.
Josh, I'm too young to have made the Patty Hearst reference, so that came from Lance.
I mean, look, could I be susceptible? Probably. But I was raised by a narcissist, so I know how they operate. So if it's going to be someone, it probably won't be Kelly.
Well,
okay.
If Kelly's listening,
hi.
You missed your opportunity. You got to step up your game with Josh.
Yeah. Was she also like a con person? She did better backyards, but were some of her businesses like fake?
Yeah, so she had a fake charity that we're looking into that was only in existence for 3 years while they were being sued by multiple people for unpaid medical bills and also for failures with their pool business. And so they're deep in debt. They have, I think, like 5 or 6 pending lawsuits, and then they start a non-for-profit charity that no one's ever heard of. So I think they were using that to funnel money into their legal fees, which they eventually fled from because they couldn't pay them. And then she was involved in this very strange company, which for now I'm calling the ABC company, which is so convoluted. I just highly recommend listening to, I believe it's episode 6. This weird, seems like a shell company based out of a different state where a lot of parallels to what Kelly was doing and this company was doing.
Yeah, very peculiar. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you look up the company and their address goes to an abandoned building and their phone number goes to just like a never-ending voicemail message. And it's one of the most bizarre and surprising components of this case because I thought I was just going to be looking into a serial killer, but here we're looking into like fraudulent businesses and like possible drug running and money laundering. So it's the case has really metastasized across the entire true crime genre, which was surprising and fascinating. Like to me, I spent a lot of time looking into missing persons and serial killers, so it was a little fun to do something different and look into like shell companies.
Are you planning on speaking with any of her relatives, like her brothers or anything?
Yeah, so her brother and I'm sure you've experienced this, would love to participate in an interview, but we just can't get it scheduled, which is a thing that happened a lot with the Keys case, where people want to participate, and then as soon as you're like, okay, let's make it official, they kind of disappear. So we'll see what happens with that, but fingers crossed, tomorrow am supposed to be interviewing the chief of police who investigated Kelly, as well as one of the Cochran's friends who actually turned FBI informant. So,
wow.
Yeah, a lot of people in this case are really actively involved, which is great because that was not the case with Keys. So I'm interested to kind of talk to people who were on the ground and really experiencing this.
Is it still an active case?
No. So interestingly, she first was tried in Michigan for murdering her lover, Chris Regan, and was found guilty and given life in prison. And then she went and faced trial in Indiana for murdering her husband. And she pled out, and mind you, she already has life in prison, so there's nothing really to gain or lose in this plea agreement. But somehow it was entered into the plea agreement that if she pled guilty, they could not investigate, or they couldn't indict, arraign, or prosecute her for any other murders in the state of Indiana. So, which to me makes no sense at all, because why would they do that? Because she's already got life in prison. And it also, to me, screams like there are more victims in Indiana. Yeah. She's including this in her plea agreement. So the case is closed. They are not investigating. And so that's kind of where I feel like, well, kind of like with Keys, if no one's going to do this, I might as well.
Is anyone else investigating missing persons other than you?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, I'm working, like, people on, and my team, like, it's not totally fair, but, like, people who are working with me on the podcast are, but to my knowledge, no one else is.
Wow. Renegade. Trailblazer.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. It could be something or it could be nothing.
You mentioned that you were talking to the chief of police. Is this the female chief of police?
Yes, which is another, like, weird branch of this story.
Yeah. Well, tell us why is that weird?
She was the first female police officer in this town in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And then after working there for, I think, like 20 years, she became the first female chief of police in all of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And shortly after they started investigating Kelly Cochran, the town hired a new city manager who had a long list of firings as city manager in other cities for corruption, sexism, misappropriation of funds, and yet this town hired him anyway. And as soon as he came in, he basically targeted Chief Rizzo and did everything in his power to get her fired, and basically waited for her to get Kelly arraigned, finish the investigation, and right before it was supposed to go to trial, he fired her. And then he became kind of the PR machine behind the investigation into Kelly, even though Chief Rizzo had done all the work and made all the relationships to make it happen. So he's kind of a piece of shit. And then she had to, she couldn't get a job anywhere. She ended up working at Olive Garden, this 25-year police veteran who had solved the most notorious case in the Upper Peninsula history. And now she's working at Olive Garden for tips. It's just a devastating, weird tertiary story in this whole case.
On what grounds was she fired?
So it's funny because when he announced it, it was for irreconcilable differences. And then when she filed for unemployment, they said that they granted unemployment based on irreconcilable differences. And suddenly he changed it and said it was for insubordination and for cussing in front of him.
Cussing.
She was able to, yeah. She was able to win the unemployment, but then when she sued for wrongful termination, she lost the case, which is really sad. And then she appealed and lost the appeal.
Was she replaced by a man?
She, for a long time, wasn't replaced at all. And that's a good question that I don't have an answer for. But I would be surprised if she was replaced by a woman.
Right. Wow. And how have you not written an 8-part Fargo-style narrative series about this? Because this has so much character development potential, backdrop of a serial killer, a female serial killer, cannibalism. I mean, you have a whole group of people who unintentionally became cannibals. That's insane.
I think, and that's the thing where people get upset that we're not doing keys, and I'm like, no, this story is wild. There's so many pieces of the story that, so I think we'll see what happens. What's interesting is with keys, I had the files right away from the FBI, and I had 3 years to go over them. I'm working with smaller jurisdictions now, and while we filed everything, 6 months ago, because of smaller jurisdictions and now the coronavirus, I haven't received a single file from any of the 3 agencies yet. So it's also every week I wake up and I'm like, oh, I don't know what this week is going to look like. So all the investigating right now I'm doing on my own. I was able to pull some profiles so I know where they were at certain times. I have some of their cell phone records, but I don't have any of the police files. Allegedly, they're being mailed to me this week, but this is the 7th week in a row where I've heard that. So yeah, I'm eager to get those files and see everything I'm missing, because they've sent me a table of contents and it's actually more file rich than the keys files were.
Great.
But once I have those and have a comprehensive look, I imagine there's quite a bit more story to tell here.
You've done this a lot. You did it with Keys, and you're doing it with Cochran. These, you're filing Freedom of Information Acts to get FBI files and case files. There's a lot of newcomers to the true crime podcasting, producing a true crime show. Do you have any advice? Do you have any technique that you use? Because you can go about it the wrong way, or you can go about it, the Josh Hallmark way. What's your advice to people who are starting off? They want to get into a case, they want to do a deep dive, and they want to get all the files. How do you start?
I would say, especially with true crime, because it's a very populated genre right now. So figure out what your niche is. Figure out what separates you from other true crime shows, because we're not competitors by any means, but you do need to stand out. So figure out what you're going to do differently, and then do your own research. I cannot stress that enough. So file FOIAs. You need to do it at least 90 days in advance. I recommend 120 days in advance. And my biggest thing with Keyes was I did not listen to anything else about him when I started researching him, because I didn't want anything to bias my perspectives or views, and I just wanted to go in fresh and with a clean slate and develop my own narrative and my own ideas. So I highly recommend just like avoid any pop culture references or media references that are not research based to whatever you're looking into, so you have your own voice, and so it's not reductive or a copy of someone else's work. Like, have your own voice. I think those are the biggest ones. Stay true to yourself. My biggest regret with my first season was I wanted to tell the story while simultaneously looking at the story behind the story, which is like, how is true crime impacting investigations? How is true crime impacting the people involved in it? And after 3 episodes, I got some criticisms of like, oh, he's intellectual, he needs to stop, like, this isn't about him, he's, and so I immediately stopped doing that, and I really regret it, because I think that's an important story to tell. So yeah, like, figure out what you're doing, what makes you different, and do not veer from that. And then, again, do your own research. You do not want to, like, even sound like you're copying someone else. Like, have your own ideas, your own points of view, stay true to them.